Racist cop shoves black woman's daughter, not knowing her mother prosecutes high-level police crimes. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Ava Johnson was a bright young woman, full of dreams and determination. At only 16, she had an unshakable confidence in herself and her future. That day, she was walking through the park, a smile on her face as she thought about the weekend plans with her family. Little did she know, a simple trip to the park would soon turn into something she would never forget. Officer Daniel Foster, a tall, broad-shouldered white cop, had been patrolling the area. He had a reputation for being strict, often quick to assume the worst in people. His eyes scanned the crowd, and when they landed on Ava, a black girl strolling alone, his suspicion immediately flared. He had seen her earlier, walking in the park with a calm demeanor, but something about her, something about the way she walked, didn't sit right with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong there. Ava had always been careful to present herself in a way that showed respect for others, but Officer Foster didn't see it that way. His instincts, fueled by prejudice, led him to assume she was up to no good. Without warning, he approached her, his heavy footsteps making her heart race. "Hey you, stop right there," Officer Foster barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Ava turned to face him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What's the problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Foster didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned her up and down as if he was looking for something, anything that could justify his actions. "You're acting suspicious," he finally said, his tone laced with suspicion. "I'm just walking through the park," Ava replied calmly. "I'm not doing anything wrong." But Foster wasn't listening. "I don't trust people like you," he muttered under his breath, taking a step forward. Ava felt her pulse quicken as he shoved her back, making her stumble. She had done nothing wrong, but it didn't seem to matter. In that moment, the world around her blurred. She felt humiliated, small, and vulnerable. The crowd around them watched in silence, some too afraid to intervene, others too indifferent to care. Ava's heart raced as she tried to steady herself, but Officer Foster wasn't finished. He stood over her, his eyes cold, not realizing the gravity of the situation. Ava's eyes, however, were clear. She knew exactly what was at stake. She knew exactly what her mother, FBI agent Rachel Johnson, had been working for years to expose, a system of corruption within the police force itself. Ava wasn't just any young girl. She wasn't just a random target for a racist officer. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful women in the FBI, a woman who had dedicated her life to fighting injustice, especially within the very institution that Officer Foster represented. As Officer Foster continued to tower over Ava, not knowing the true identity of the girl he had just shoved, Ava's thoughts flashed to her mother's voice, the voice that had always taught her to stay strong, to never back down in the face of adversity. The truth was coming. Ava didn't need to say a word. The moment of humiliation she was experiencing was just the beginning of something much bigger. She would stand tall, like her mother had taught her, and when the time came, the whole world would know exactly who she was. Ava stood frozen as Officer Daniel Foster towered over her, his heavy gaze filled with distrust. The moment seemed to stretch out for an eternity, the world around her growing distant as the anger and humiliation weighed down on her. She had always been taught to stay calm in the face of adversity, to never let others see her flinch. But today, that lesson felt like a distant memory. She was not just a teenage girl in a park anymore. She was a part of something much bigger. Officer Foster, in his misguided arrogance, had no idea who he was dealing with. As he continued to stand there, puffing himself up in front of her, Ava's mind began to race. She thought about her mother, FBI agent Rachel Johnson, and everything she had been doing behind the scenes to expose corruption in the very force Officer Foster represented. Ava's mother had dedicated her life to justice, working tirelessly to bring down corrupt cops, but it was a dangerous game. Ava had always admired her mother's strength, and now, in this moment, she had to find her own. She felt the weight of the eyes on her, the onlookers who had gathered around, unsure of what to do, unsure of where to place their loyalties. Ava didn't need their help. She didn't need anyone to fight her battles for her. She was going to fight this one herself. Slowly, she stood up straighter, meeting Officer Foster's gaze with unwavering determination. The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. Ava knew that in this moment, she had the power to take control of the situation. She was no longer just a girl being bullied by a racist cop. She was someone far more important. Her mind shifted back to her mother's teachings, the values of fairness and justice that had been ingrained in her since she was a child. She wasn't about to let someone like Officer Foster destroy her dignity. She wasn't going to let him make her feel small. The truth about who she was, who her mother was about to be revealed. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same. Officer Foster's words faded into the background as Ava took a deep breath, her resolve hardening like steel. She was done being silent. She was done being overlooked. She wasn't just going to stand there and take his insults. Ava slowly took out her phone, her fingers steady despite the rising tension. The world around her seemed to fall away as she dialed the one number she knew would change everything. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, her mother's voice answered, calm and professional as always. "Mom," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need you." Rachel's tone shifted instantly, her concern palpable. "Ava, what's wrong?" "There's a cop here," Ava started, her words steady despite the pounding in her chest. "And he doesn't know who I am." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Rachel responded with calm certainty. "I'll be there, Ava. Stay strong." Ava could feel her mother's presence even through the phone, and it gave her the strength to keep going. She ended the call and stood tall, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Officer Foster looked at her, his gaze still filled with arrogance. But there was something else now, a flicker of uncertainty. Ava knew that once her mother arrived, the entire narrative would change. The balance of power would shift, and Officer Foster, for all his authority and bravado, would be left standing in the wake of his own ignorance. Ava stood tall, her breath steady and her posture unshakable as Officer Foster continued to loom over her. The crowd around them had grown, whispers of disbelief filling the air. People were watching, waiting, unsure of what would happen next. Ava could feel their eyes on her, but her focus remained fixed. She was no longer just a scared teenager, standing before a racist cop. She was more than that now. Her mother's calm voice on the phone echoed in her mind, urging her to stay strong, to hold her ground. Ava's fingers brushed against her phone in her pocket, the cold, hard reality of the moment sinking in. She knew her mother would be there soon. FBI agent Rachel Johnson, one of the highest-ranking agents in the Bureau, was the last person anyone would want to face in a situation like this. Ava's thoughts shifted as she heard a car door slam in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart skipped a beat. The tension in the air grew thicker. The moment of reckoning was approaching. Ava stood her ground, her back straight and her head held high, despite the anger and humiliation she had just endured. Officer Foster's smug expression faltered for a moment as he glanced toward the street, his attention briefly diverted. It was enough time for Ava to send one last glance toward the crowd, her eyes silently pleading for them to understand. She wasn't just a victim. She was someone who had the power to make this situation right. And when her mother arrived, things would change. Officer Foster shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching at his side as he tried to regain control of the situation. But Ava could see the cracks in his confidence. He was a man who thought he was untouchable, but now he was beginning to realize that he was standing on shaky ground. Moments later, a car rolled up to the curb, and out stepped Rachel Johnson, her presence unmistakable. She walked with purpose, her eyes scanning the scene as she approached the gathering. The moment she laid eyes on Ava, everything seemed to pause. The anger that had been swelling inside Ava suddenly faded, replaced by a sense of calm. Her mother was here, the woman who had fought for justice her entire life. The woman who had never backed down was now standing beside her. Rachel's sharp gaze turned toward Officer Foster, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. She wasn't one to speak without knowing the full story, but the look in her eyes told Foster everything he needed to know. This was not a situation he could control with his arrogance. Rachel walked toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. "Is there a problem here, officer?" she asked, her voice cold but commanding. Officer Foster shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to handle the situation. "This girl," he started, but Rachel cut him off. "I'm sorry, what's your name, officer?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Officer Daniel Foster," he said, his voice shaky. Rachel didn't flinch. "Officer Foster, you've just assaulted my daughter. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" The words hung in the air, the tension thickening once more as the crowd watched in stunned silence. Ava felt a rush of relief flood over her. Her mother had arrived, and she was here to make sure that justice would be served. Officer Foster's face turned pale as the weight of Rachel's words sank in. He stammered, trying to find an excuse, but nothing came out. He knew he was caught. The truth was unfolding in front of him, and there was no way to escape the consequences of his actions. Rachel turned back to Ava, her eyes softening. "You did well, sweetheart. Now, let's make sure he understands what happens when you abuse your power." Ava nodded, a small smile forming on her face. The injustice she had faced was far from over, but in this moment, with her mother by her side, she knew that things were about to change. Officer Foster might have thought he could get away with treating Ava like a criminal, but the real lesson was about to unfold. One he would never forget. Ava stood next to her mother, FBI agent Rachel Johnson, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone in this battle. Officer Foster was standing there, his face pale, his confidence shattered. The crowd that had gathered around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The tension in the air was palpable as Rachel's sharp eyes locked onto the officer, her presence commanding and unwavering. "You know, Officer Foster," Rachel began, her voice calm but filled with authority, "you've just made a mistake that will cost you more than you can imagine." The words hung in the air, and Ava could see the shift in Foster's expression. What had once been arrogance and dismissal now turned to uncertainty and fear. He took a step back, as if realizing the gravity of the situation. Rachel's gaze never left him. "I've been fighting for justice my entire career," she continued, her tone unwavering. "And now, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. Your behavior today, treating my daughter like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin, won't go unpunished." Officer Foster swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the scene, looking for a way out. But there was no escape. He had crossed the line, and now Rachel, as well as the law, would hold him accountable. Rachel pulled out her phone and dialed a number, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with Internal Affairs," she said without taking her eyes off Foster. "And I'll make sure the right people know about your actions today." Ava watched as her mother handled the situation with grace and poise, her strength undeniable. She had always known her mother was powerful, but seeing her in action like this filled her with pride. She wasn't just Ava's mom. She was a force of justice, someone who had fought for years to make sure the truth was known. As Rachel spoke to someone on the phone, Officer Foster stood there, his face growing more and more crimson. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the whispers growing louder. He was a man who had once felt untouchable, his badge a shield that protected him from consequences. But now, that shield was nothing more than a thin layer of paper, and it was being torn apart by the truth. Ava stepped forward, her voice steady but strong. "Officer Foster, you don't get to treat me like that," she said, her words carrying the weight of her mother's unwavering justice. "I'm not just some random person you can bully. I'm the daughter of an FBI agent, and my mother will make sure you face the consequences of your actions. The words felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. For so long, she had been forced to remain silent, to endure the looks and the judgment. But in this moment, with her mother by her side, Ava realized she had the power to change the narrative. Officer Foster looked like he was about to say something, but Rachel cut him off. "Save your excuses," she said. "The people who matter will know the truth, and you won't be able to hide behind your badge any longer." Rachel ended the call and turned her attention back to the officer. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs soon, and I suggest you take this time to reflect on what you've done." With that, Rachel motioned for Ava to follow her. As they walked away, Ava felt a sense of justice settle over her. This wasn't just about the officer. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As they got into the car, Ava couldn't help but smile at her mother. "You were amazing, Mom." Rachel smiled back, her eyes filled with pride. "We're not done yet, Ava. But today, we made sure the truth was heard." Ava nodded, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. But with her mother by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. Ava and Rachel drove in silence, the weight of the situation still heavy in the air. Ava stared out the window, watching the world pass by, but her mind was racing. It wasn't just about the incident with Officer Foster. It wasn't just about the way he had treated her. It was the realization that things had to change, that this was just one moment in a larger story, one that had been unfolding for years. As they neared their home, Rachel turned to her daughter, breaking the silence. "You did good today, Ava. I'm proud of you." Ava turned to her mother, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I just did what you taught me. I didn't want to be a victim." Rachel's eyes softened. "You never were, sweetheart. You just didn't know how much power you had until now. But today, you stood up for yourself, and you did it in a way that was true to who you are. That's what matters." Ava nodded, absorbing her mother's words. They reached their driveway, and as Rachel parked the car, Ava realized she had been holding her breath the entire drive. It was over, or at least this part of it was. But she knew that the real fight had just begun. After a brief moment of quiet, Rachel turned off the engine and faced her daughter. "This isn't just about one cop. It's about the system that allows people like him to think they can get away with this kind of behavior. And now we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again." Ava looked at her mother, feeling a surge of determination. "What happens next?" Rachel smiled, a glint of confidence in her eyes. "Now, we take this to the next level. You're going to help me expose the truth. Together, we'll make sure people know what's really going on." Ava felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She had always admired her mother's courage, but now she would be a part of it. It wasn't just about standing up for herself anymore. It was about helping others who couldn't. Over the next few days, the investigation into Officer Foster began to unfold. Rachel worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and contacting the right people. Ava, though still a teenager, was more involved than ever before. She helped her mother sift through the paperwork, keeping track of crucial details, and even sat in on some of the conversations with other FBI agents. The power of truth was beginning to take shape, and Ava was starting to understand just how much power she had, not only as the daughter of a dedicated FBI agent, but as a person who was no longer willing to stay silent. One afternoon, after school, Ava sat in the living room, going over some notes, when Rachel came in, her face set with determination. "We've got something," she said, holding up a thick file. "This is going to be the turning point. With this, we can prove that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It's part of something much bigger." Ava took the file, her hands trembling slightly. She opened it, scanning the documents. What she saw was worse than she could have imagined. There were reports, internal memos, and testimonies that pointed to a pattern of abuse within the police department. It wasn't just Officer Foster. There were others. Others who thought they could get away with treating people the way Foster had treated Ava. But now, the truth was out, and they would have to face the consequences. Ava looked up at her mother, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happens now?" Rachel's voice was calm, but there was a fire behind it. "Now, we make sure that everyone who is involved is held accountable. We won't stop until the truth comes out, and we will make sure this never happens again. Ava nodded, feeling a surge of pride. She had been part of something huge, something that could change everything. The fight wasn't over, but with her mother by her side, Ava knew they could face whatever came next. The journey was far from finished, but she was ready. The truth would not be silenced any longer. Ava sat at the kitchen table, the thick file her mother had given her spread out before her. The documents, full of evidence and testimonies, had opened her eyes to the extent of corruption within the police department. What began as a single incident, with Officer Foster shoving her in the park, had now snowballed into something much larger. As she sifted through the papers, Ava couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. She had always been a quiet observer of the world around her, but now she was in the middle of a fight that could change everything. Her mother, FBI agent Rachel Johnson, had always told her that standing up for what was right required strength, patience, and persistence. But this was more than just standing up for herself. This was about making sure that others wouldn't have to endure the same injustice that she had. The phone rang, pulling Ava from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw her mother's name. Rachel had been in meetings all day, working with the team to piece together the details of the case. "Hey, Mom." Ava answered, her voice steady. "How's it going?" "We've got movement," Rachel replied, her tone focused. "The internal investigation is underway. We've got enough evidence now to bring this to court." Ava's heart skipped a beat. It was happening. They were moving forward, and the truth would soon be exposed. "That's amazing," Ava said, her excitement building. "But what does this mean for Officer Foster?" Rachel's voice hardened. "He's not going to get away with this. We've already contacted the higher-ups, and they're taking this seriously now. This won't be swept under the rug like so many others before it." Ava smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. She had watched her mother fight for justice her entire life, but this time it was personal. It was about her, about what had happened to her in that park, and about the change that needed to come. "What can I do to help?" Ava asked, feeling a new sense of purpose. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Rachel responded. "I need you to keep doing what you're doing. Stay focused. Help me go through this evidence. There's more to uncover, and we need every detail." Ava nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "I'm on it," she said. As she went back to the file, Ava felt a sense of resolve. This wasn't just about exposing Officer Foster. It was about holding the system accountable, about showing that no one was above the law. Ava wasn't sure how long this process would take, but she knew it was worth fighting for. Hours passed, and the work continued. As the sun set and the room grew dim, Ava's phone buzzed again. It was a message from her mother. "They're going to make an arrest tomorrow. Foster is being taken into custody. This is just the beginning." Ava's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The moment they had been working toward was finally here. She felt a rush of emotion, pride, relief, but also a quiet understanding that this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey. Her mother's fight was far from over, but Ava had proven to herself that she could be part of it. She could make a difference. She could stand up for what was right. That night, as Ava lay in bed, she couldn't help but think about all the others who had been victims of injustice. She thought about the people who had suffered silently, just like she had, and she vowed to keep fighting for them too. Ava knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Ava woke up the next morning with a sense of determination that hadn't been there before. The events of the past few days had felt like a whirlwind, but now she knew exactly what needed to be done. The arrest of Officer Foster had been a major step, but Ava understood that this was just the beginning. She had spent the entire night going over the evidence again, her eyes tired but her mind sharp. She was starting to see the bigger picture, one that went beyond her own experience. This was about justice, about accountability, about making sure that people who used their power to hurt others would no longer be able to hide behind their badges. Rachel had warned her that the path ahead would be long, but Ava wasn't scared. She was ready to face whatever came next. As she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, Rachel walked in, her expression serious but not without a hint of pride. "It's happening, Ava," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Foster's arrest is just the first step, but now we're going after the others. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had suspected that there were others involved, but hearing her mother say it out loud made it all the more real. What do we do next? Ava asked, her voice unwavering. We keep digging, Rachel replied. We've got enough evidence now to take this to the next level, but we need to be smart. We can't rush this. The truth has to come out, but we need to make sure we do it the right way. Ava nodded. She had learned so much in the last few days, but the most important lesson was that justice wasn't about rushing to the finish line. It was about making sure the truth was uncovered, no matter how long it took. As the days went by, the investigation intensified. Rachel and Ava worked side by side, carefully piecing together the puzzle. The more they uncovered, the more they realized how deep the corruption went. It wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a system that had been broken for far too long. But Ava was determined to see it through. One afternoon, Rachel came home from a meeting with some of her colleagues. She looked exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes. We've got something, she said, handing Ava a thick envelope. This is going to change everything. Ava opened the envelope, her hands shaking slightly as she pulled out the documents inside. They were official internal reports, testimonies, and evidence that pointed directly to several officers who had been involved in the same kinds of abuses as Officer Foster. It was damning. This was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. We're going to take this to court, Rachel said, her voice filled with resolve. This is bigger than we thought, Ava, but we can't back down now. We have to make sure the truth comes out. Ava felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just about making sure Officer Foster faced consequences. It was about exposing the entire network that had allowed these officers to abuse their power. It was about giving a voice to all the people who had suffered in silence, just like she had. We won't stop, Ava said, her voice strong. We're going to make sure they all pay for what they've done. Rachel smiled, proud of her daughter's strength. I knew you'd say that, she said, and I'm glad you're with me on this. As they continued to prepare the case, Ava knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, there would be pushback, but they were ready. The truth was on their side, and with each passing day, they were getting closer to making sure that justice would prevail. Ava wasn't just the daughter of an FBI agent anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something that would change the system, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Ava and Rachel stood side by side in the courtroom, their eyes focused on the judge's bench. The case they had been working on for weeks was about to unfold in front of them. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as people took their seats, the tension in the air thick with anticipation. Ava felt the weight of it all. The long hours spent going through the evidence, the sleepless nights, the emotional toll of reliving the injustices she had faced. But now, standing in this courtroom, she knew they were one step closer to making sure those who had wronged her, and so many others, would finally face the consequences. Rachel's calm presence beside her gave Ava the strength she needed. She had always admired her mother's ability to stay composed in the face of adversity, and now, Ava was beginning to understand what it took to be strong, not just in body, but in spirit. The prosecutor entered the room, his gaze briefly meeting Rachel's before he nodded to Ava. It was clear that this was more than just a case to him. It was a mission, one that could bring about real change. As the trial began, Rachel took her place at the front, prepared to lay out the facts in front of the court. Ava watched as her mother began speaking, her voice steady and filled with authority. She was used to seeing Rachel in control, but today it was different. There was a quiet fire behind her words, a sense of urgency that Ava had never seen before. As Rachel walked the jury through the evidence, Ava's mind raced. She had been a part of this journey, but hearing it all laid out in front of her so clearly and definitively made it all feel real. Officer Foster's actions weren't just isolated moments of injustice. They were part of a pattern that went much deeper, a pattern that had been allowed to continue for far too long. With every testimony, with every piece of evidence presented, Ava could feel the room shift. The defense tried to undermine the validity of their case, but Rachel was unflinching, her arguments airtight. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that the truth was finally being heard, loud and clear. As the day went on, Rachel continued to dismantle the defense's arguments, their attempts to distract and deflect falling short in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The courtroom was silent as the final witness took the stand, the last piece of the puzzle that would seal the case. It was a former colleague of Officer Foster, someone who had witnessed the corruption from within. His testimony was damning. Ava could see the shift in the room as the weight of his words sank in. The defense attorneys were scrambling now, trying to recover, but it was too late. The truth had been laid bare. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours, but in the end, there was no question. Officer Foster was guilty. Ava's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been wronged, every person who had suffered in silence. Justice had been served, not just for Ava, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly by those in power. As they left the courtroom, Ava felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They had done it. The fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, and the truth still had to be exposed. But in this moment, Ava knew that they had made a difference. They had stood up to the injustice, and they had won. Rachel looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with pride. "You did good, Ava. You've helped make the world a better place." Ava smiled, her heart full. "We did it, Mom. Together." Ava sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the past few weeks finally settling in. The case against Officer Foster had been a turning point, but as she looked over the evidence once again, she realized this was just one victory in a much larger fight. It wasn't enough to simply expose the wrongdoings of one officer. They needed to ensure that no one would be able to abuse their power like he had. The truth had been revealed, but now it was time to ensure that the system would change, that the pattern of corruption would end. Rachel entered the room, her presence steady and confident as always. Ava could see the fatigue in her mother's eyes, but there was also a quiet satisfaction. The hard work had paid off, but Rachel knew, as Ava did, that their journey wasn't over. "You did great, Ava," Rachel said, her voice filled with pride. Ava looked up at her mother, feeling a rush of gratitude. "We did it, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." Rachel smiled softly and sat down across from her. "You got your own strength, Ava. You always have. But now you see what it takes to fight for what's right. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Ava nodded, understanding the depth of her mother's words. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice steady. Rachel leaned back, in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "Now, we continue to expose the truth. The investigation is far from over. Foster was just one piece of the puzzle. We have to make sure the entire system is held accountable." Ava felt a sense of resolve building inside her. This was more than just about making sure one officer faced the consequences of his actions. This was about changing the way the system operated, about ensuring that no one could use their power to hurt others without facing the consequences. "I'm ready," Ava said, her voice unwavering. "I'm not stopping now." Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded, uncovering more instances of misconduct within the department. Rachel and Ava continued to work side by side, sifting through evidence and speaking to witnesses, gathering the pieces they needed to build a stronger case. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when it felt like the system was too powerful to break. But Ava held onto the lessons her mother had taught her. That justice wasn't always quick, but it was always worth fighting for. And with each step they took, they got closer to making real change. The day finally came when the evidence they had gathered was presented to a wider audience. The case against the corrupt officers had reached the public, and the response was overwhelming. People were speaking out, demanding justice, and the momentum was undeniable. Ava felt a rush of emotion as she watched the news coverage unfold. This was what they had been working for. This was the change they had been fighting for. As the trial continued, more officers were arrested, and the truth about the extent of the corruption within the department was laid bare for all to see. Ava and Rachel knew this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, but they were ready. They had stood up against the system, and now they were changing it. Ava smiled as she looked at her mother, feeling a deep sense of pride. "We did it, Mom," she said softly. Rachel smiled back, her eyes filled with pride and determination. "Yes, we did, Ava. And we're just getting started.